So sometimes there's more than one potential noun phrase that could act as the implied or silent subject of the non-finite embedded clause. So in the example here, Jareth told Hoggle to give the peach to Sarah. The non-finite, that is no tense, embedded clause is to give the peach to Sarah. So the question is, who is the subject of give? Who's the one doing the giving in this embedded clause? Jareth told Hoggle to give the peach to Sarah. Is it Jareth giving the peach or Hoggle giving the peach, right? There's more than one potential implied subject. And what we find is that for adults, they say that it's Hoggle, right? Jareth told Hoggle, and Hoggle is the one giving the peach to Sarah. And apologies for the funky coloring here, so my keynote misbehaving. But suffice it to say, it's Hoggle who's giving the peach to Sarah for adults, right? Now, what about this one? Hoggle promised Jareth to do so. So who is doing so? Who promised to do so, in some sense? Who's the subject of the doing? And again, for adults, again, this may be sort of a less common way to talk about things, but when given this, Hoggle promised Jareth to do so, it's Hoggle is the one doing so. In this case, Jareth told Hoggle to do something. It's the object, right? Told Hoggle. The object which functions as the implied subject, but here Hoggle promised Jareth to do so. It's the subject that over here is acting like the implied subject of our non-finite clause. So we see different interpretations that adults have learned, right? So what do children do? Right, well, and how do we actually test what they do? So Carol Chomsky in 1969 was testing 5 to 10-year-old children to see how they would interpret these kinds of utterances. And so they knew tell, and it was also making sure that they knew the meaning of promise. So those two verbs that we just saw before with the adult interpretations. And so after making sure kids understood what the verbs meant, right, she then asked them to act out sentences like the following. Bozo the clown here, Bozo tells Donald to hop up and down. Make him do it. Right? So who is hopping up and down? Right? Because that will tell you who's the implied subject of hopping. And for adults, they made Donald hop up and down. Right? And what about Bozo promises Donald to hop up and down? Again, this may be a less common utterance now as opposed to in 1969, but Bozo promises Donald to hop up and down, make him do it, and when pressed, adults will say, okay, it's Bozo who's doing the hopping up and down, right? So we have that same idea where when it's tell, it's the object, in this case the indirect object, that's the implied subject. When it's promise, it's the subject that's the implied subject. That's what we saw before. Now, what about kids? Well, it turns out that no matter which one you give them, tell or promise, kids prefer Donald, right? So Bozo tells Donald to hop up and down, and they make Donald hop. Bozo promises Donald to hop and down, but kids still make Donald hop. So this is where they're differing from adults. And so the initial child strategy seems to be something like pick the nearest potential subject, which in this case, for both of them, is Donald, right? And so, of course, kids must eventually learn that promise doesn't behave like tell, right? The implied subject of the embedded clause is the subject for promise, right? It's Bozo, not Donald. And, they may learn this through repeated exposure to promise and other verbs that behave the same way.